The sharp Friedrichshain wind stirred the branches of the dry trees in this winter night. The cobblestone streets, usually cozy and quiet, appeared eerie in the flickering light of the wrought iron street lamps. With each step, the rhythmic sound of boots on icy ground echoed, accompanied by the methodical clicking of a dog's claws. Karl Steinman, an 82-year-old retired history teacher, pulled his heavy coat tighter as he walked along these familiar streets. Draco, his Doberman with glossy black fur, trotted beside him, his watchful eyes scanning the darkness. The dog's presence was comforting to Karl, but tonight even Draco seemed restless. His nostrils flared slightly, picking up scents that eluded human senses. "Draco, what's gotten into you tonight?" Karl asked in a hoarse voice, weathered by age and cold. The dog responded with a short bark, his gaze fixed on the alley ahead. Karl stepped closer, not out of fear, but to shield himself from the biting wind that seemed to pierce his bones. 3 years had passed since Karl lost his wife, Hannah. Her absence had become a quiet constant in his life, an echo of memories he revisited each evening in the dusty armchair of his living room. Draco had filled part of that void, though Karl knew a dog's love, however loyal, could never replace that of his beloved Hannah. Yet Draco seemed to have been born to protect him. The memory of Draco's adoption surfaced as he crossed the street toward the nearby park. 2 years earlier, during a visit to an animal shelter in Potsdam, Karl had first laid eyes on Draco. The dog stood motionless in a corner, but his bright eyes, radiating an almost human intelligence, immediately caught Karl's attention. The shelter vet had mentioned that Draco had been found abandoned, with an unreadable microchip as the only clue to his past. Karl had never tried to uncover more about the dog's history, content with his companionship. Now, as he observed Draco's alert posture, he wondered if he had overlooked something important. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Friedrichshain, once a haven of tranquility, had begun to change. Reports of nighttime break-ins, once rare, had started to spread through neighborhood conversations. Despite this, Karl continued his daily walks. Strolling through the streets was a tradition he refused to abandon. Draco suddenly stopped, his body tensing, his snout pointing toward a dark alley surrounded by buildings with crumbling facades. "What is it, boy?" Karl asked, leaning forward and gripping the leash tighter. The dog growled softly, his muscles taut like a hunter, ready to strike. Karl followed Draco's gaze and felt a shiver unrelated to the night's cold. He knew dogs often sense things humans couldn't, but he didn't want to succumb to superstition. Still, the alley seemed unnaturally quiet, as if waiting for something. He tried to pull Draco away to continue their walk, but the dog resisted, his behavior signaling imminent danger. "Come on, Draco. There's nothing there," Karl said, trying to sound confident, though his voice betrayed a slight tremble. Draco, however, remained steadfast, his eyes locked on the darkness. The next few minutes felt like hours. Karl sensed a growing weight in his chest, as if something invisible was watching him. He glanced around, but the streets were empty. Perhaps it was just the wind playing with the tree branches, or his mind playing tricks on him. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this night was far from normal. As they continued their walk, Karl noticed Draco's behavior becoming increasingly abnormal. The usually calm dog now moved with short, tense steps, his vigilant eyes scanning the darkness. When they reached the entrance to the narrow alley that had unsettled Draco, the Doberman suddenly stopped. He lifted his head, ears forward, and began to growl almost imperceptibly, but sharply enough to make Karl instinctively take a step back. "Draco, what's gotten into you tonight?" Karl's voice was soft, blending with the distant rustling of the wind between the buildings. The silence seemed to intensify, as if the alley itself absorbed the sounds of the surrounding city. Suddenly, Karl caught a quick movement in the corner of his eye, causing him to turn his head sharply. A faint shadow slipped through the darkness ahead, sending a chill down the old professor's spine. "Who's there?" he asked, trying to sound firm, but his voice lacked the authority he intended. Only silence answered. Draco remained in position, now tugging slightly at his leash, as if urging Karl to confront whatever was there. Reluctantly, Karl pulled the dog back. "No, Draco, let's go home. It's late." He took a step back, but his mind was anything but calm. The feeling of being watched was almost tangible, clinging to him like the night's cold. As he moved away from the alley, an old memory surfaced. A brief conversation he'd had months ago with a park ranger. "This dog looks trained, sir," the man had said, eyeing Draco curiously. "Perfect posture, quick reactions. He looks like one of those military or police dogs." At the time, Karl had laughed, thinking it was just a compliment for Draco's good discipline. But now, as he saw the almost professional intensity in the dog's eyes, he began to wonder if there was more to that remark than he'd realized. The tension grew as they continued through the empty streets. The silence seemed to stretch endlessly, interrupted only by Karl's quick steps and the sound of Draco's paws on the cobblestones. At every corner, Karl glanced over his shoulder, hoping to see nothing, but all he found was darkness. "Maybe I'm just being paranoid," he muttered to himself, as if his own voice could dispel the unease. Yet the feeling of being followed persisted. He tried to dismiss the thought, but he couldn't ignore the faint, rhythmic sounds echoing behind him. They weren't as loud or regular as his own footsteps, but they were there, enough to give him goosebumps. Draco kept looking back, as if he too could hear the stealthy steps. At one point, the Doberman stopped, turned around completely, and stared at something Karl couldn't see. "Draco, stop it," Karl said, his voice trembling. But the dog ignored him, growling louder this time. The old professor quickened his pace, and Draco followed reluctantly, but the sense of being pursued only grew stronger. Karl's heart pounded as his numb fingers clutched the leash. The lights of his street appeared in the distance, but for the first time in years, he felt no relief at the sight. As much as he tried to deny it, Karl knew something, or someone, was following them. As he turned the last corner before his house, Karl stopped abruptly. A black car, parked carelessly, partially blocked the sidewalk. The vehicle, an older model, seemed out of place in the residential area. Its windows were dark, preventing anyone from seeing inside. Draco immediately went on high alert, standing with tense muscles and pinned ears in front of Karl. "Calm down, Draco. It's probably just a neighbor," Karl muttered, trying to convince himself. But before he could finish the thought, the car doors opened almost simultaneously, and three masked figures stepped out. Without a word, they spread out strategically, forming a tight semicircle around Karl. Karl's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs hesitated. Draco, however, took a few steps forward, positioning himself between Karl and the strangers. He growled with an intensity Karl had never seen before, like a soldier ready to defend his commander. "Hey, what do you want?" Karl asked, trying to sound authoritative, but the weakness in his voice was evident. There was no immediate response. One of the men, of medium height and stocky build, stepped forward and stared at Draco. His expression was grim, but Karl noticed a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Hunse," the man said with a heavy Eastern European accent. His voice was deep but clear enough to reach Karl's ears. "What? Hunse?" Karl replied, confusion dominating his face. The man didn't answer, but the strange name echoed in Karl's mind. He looked at Draco, who now seemed even more menacing, as if the nickname held meaning for him too. The Doberman stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the man, but his growl grew louder. Karl wanted to retreat, but one of the other men stepped forward, raising a warning hand. At that moment, Karl noticed something strange, a tattoo on the man's neck, a number in the pattern of a collar. Karl's heart raced as he tried to memorize the symbol, knowing it could be important if he survived the situation. "Listen, I don't want any trouble. Leave us alone and go on your way," Karl said, trying to sound calm despite his trembling hands as he held Draco's collar. Before the situation could escalate further, it was interrupted by loud barking and the sudden illumination of lights in the neighbors' windows. A resident, noticing the unusual activity, had apparently drawn enough attention to scare off the intruders. The men exchanged brief glances and retreated to their car. "It's not over, old man," the leader said, looking directly at Karl before getting into the vehicle. As the car disappeared around the corner, Karl took a deep breath, feeling his legs almost give way beneath him. Draco had relaxed slightly but remained alert, staring in the direction where the car had vanished. "Let's go home, boy. I think we've had enough adventure for one night," Karl said, trying to sound stronger than he felt. He knew, however, that something much bigger was at play, and Draco was somehow at the center of it all. When Karl finally reached the safety of his home, his hands were still shaking as he turned the key in the lock. Once inside, he locked the door and turned to Draco. The dog paced restlessly around the living room, his ears twitching at every sound. "What's going on, Draco? Who were those people? Why did they call you Hunsi?" The question was more for himself than for the dog, who looked at Karl with intense eyes as if he understood. A few minutes later, sirens announced the arrival of the police. Concerned neighbors had called the authorities, reporting the presence of the masked men. Two officers entered the house after Karl let them in. One of them was Sergeant Rolf Bernauer, a gray-haired man with a serious demeanor, known in the neighborhood for his patience and experience. He began asking questions while the younger officer took photos of the scene. "So, Mr. Steinman," Rolf began, his gaze scanning every detail of the surroundings, "can you describe what happened?" Karl recounted everything as accurately as his memory allowed, including Draco's strange behavior, the men blocking their path, and the mention of the mysterious name. When he got to the part about the tattoo on one of the attackers' necks, Rolf's eyes narrowed. "A number and a collar, you say?" He looked thoughtful, as if the description stirred unpleasant memories. Then the sergeant's gaze fell on Draco, who sat beside Karl, staring intently at the visitor. After a few seconds of silence, Rolf muttered almost to himself, "This can't be. He looks like Titan." "Titan?" Karl repeated, confused. "What are you talking about?" Rolf leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and the tone of the conversation shifted from formal to personal. "It might sound strange to you, but many years ago, during the Cold War, there was a special program in the Eastern Bloc to train dogs. They were used for high-level military and police missions, trained to respond to precise commands in multiple languages. Titan was the name of one of those dogs. He disappeared years ago." Karl shook his head in disbelief. "Are you saying my Draco is this Titan? That's ridiculous. I adopted him from a shelter in Potsdam. He's just a rescue dog." Rolf raised an eyebrow. "And how much do you know about his past? Any details you could never explain?" Karl hesitated, remembering the unreadable microchip found on Draco when he was adopted. The silence was enough for Rolf to continue. "There are rumors that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, many of these dogs were smuggled out and sold on the black market. They were worth a fortune, as their abilities were considered almost supernatural. Some ended up in the wrong hands." Before Karl could fully process the information, the younger officer returned with something he had found near the alley where the car had been parked. It was a crumpled piece of paper with a hastily scrawled message. "Titan is with them. Not safe. He will be hunted." At these words, Karl's stomach turned. He looked at Rolf, hoping the officer would reassure him, but the sergeant's expression was grim. "You need to be careful. If these men know where you live, they'll likely return. And if they really want the dog, they'll do anything to get him back." Draco, sitting beside Karl, let out a low growl, as if understanding the looming threat. Karl placed his hand on the dog's head, trying to calm him. "He's mine now. I won't let anyone hurt my Draco." Rolf stood up, adjusting his belt. "We'll do our best to monitor the situation, but I can't promise we can protect you from everything. I suggest you take precautions and inform us of any suspicious activity." As the officers left, Karl leaned back in his chair, exhausted. He looked at Draco, who stood watchfully beside him. "Titan or not, you're mine, boy. We'll face this together." In the days following the incident, Draco's presence in Friedrichshain became the talk of the neighborhood. The story of how the old man and his dog had stood up to criminals, and the rumor that Draco might be the legendary Titan, spread quickly. Children pointed at Draco as he walked by, and some braver neighbors even tried to pet him, though the dog remained reserved, always staying close to Karl. Karl, however, felt torn. While proud of his dog, he couldn't ignore the danger this newfound attention brought. Deep down, he knew the masked men likely wouldn't give up so easily. His worry grew with each passing day. One morning, as Karl sipped coffee on his balcony, Sergeant Rolf Bernauer appeared at his door, carrying a bulky briefcase and a serious expression. Mr. Steinman, can we talk? Of course, come in, Karl said, making room. Draco, lying at Karl's feet, lifted his head and watched the visitor intently. Rolf sat in the chair across from Karl and opened his briefcase, revealing old photos and yellow documents. I've done some digging since our last conversation, Rolf began, showing a photo of a group of dogs, among them a Doberman that looked exactly like Draco. These are records from the Eastern Bloc's special training program. Each dog was assigned a code, and Hun Si was one of the most talented. The resemblance to Draco is striking. Karl studied the photo, feeling the weight of the information. But why would someone call him that now, so many years later? And why would they be after him? Rolf pointed to another document. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, there were reports that many of these dogs were sold to criminal networks. They were used for surveillance, message delivery, and even illegal activities. Their training was so advanced that these animals remained highly valuable to the right buyers. Karl sighed deeply. So you're telling me Draco might have been part of that? That he could have a dark past? We don't know for sure, Rolf replied, but his behavior that night suggests he instinctively recognized the danger. It's likely he was trained for combat situations. Karl fell silent, processing the thought that his loyal companion might have such a mysterious past. Meanwhile, Draco stared at the table, as if understanding the gravity of the conversation. There's more, Rolf said, handing Karl a small object found near the alley the night of the incident. It was a worn military badge with the number 6 engraved on it. This confirms they know exactly who he is. Karl took the badge with trembling hands, feeling the symbolic weight of the small piece of metal. What now? What can I do to protect him? For now, it's best to stay discreet. They know where you live, so it would be wise to avoid going out at night and to install surveillance cameras. Also, keep in constant contact with me. If anything suspicious happens, I need to know immediately. As Rolf spoke, Karl thought about what this meant for his quiet life. He knew Friedrichshain was safer with Draco, but he also knew it came at a cost. The news that the dog might be a living legend seemed to give the locals a sense of security he couldn't guarantee. A few days later, the local police decided to honor Draco with a symbolic medal. The small ceremony took place in the town square, where residents gathered to applaud the guardian of Friedrichshain. Draco maintained a firm stance throughout the event, as if aware of the moment's significance. Karl, standing beside him, held the leash with pride, but his thoughts were uneasy. This will only draw more attention, he muttered to himself as camera flashes captured the moment. After the ceremony, Karl noticed a shift in the neighborhood's dynamics. With Draco's presence, there seemed to be fewer reports of crime, and the neighbors felt more united, as if they had found a symbol of collective strength. Yet Karl couldn't shake the feeling of threat. Every evening he checked the windows and locked the door twice, hoping the masked men wouldn't return. One evening, as he sat on the balcony with Draco, Karl looked at the dog and said, "You're more than I thought, boy, but that probably means they won't give up so easily." Draco tilted his head, as if responding to Karl's concern with his piercing gaze. Despite the dangers that still lurked, Karl knew they would face whatever came their way, together. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Thanks to our valued viewers, we continue to improve every day. Please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up.